Imagine a case so chilling, so relentless, that even the world's most seasoned demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren, found themselves powerless. The Smurl family case stands as one of the most controversial and haunting experiences in the Heimby Warrens' storied history. Join us as we unravel the disturbing events inside a Pennsylvania duplex that housed a darkness no prayer seemed able to purge. The year was 1973. Jack and Janet Smurl, a young couple with 4 daughters, were seeking a fresh start. After enduring the destruction of their previous home by Hurricane Agnes, they moved into a modest duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. The home, shared with Jack's elderly parents, seemed at first to offer solace. It was the kind of American dream so many families aspired to: a small-town neighborhood, friendly neighbors, and enough space for their children to grow. But almost immediately, the house whispered its warnings. It began with the mundane: a cold draft that would slip through sealed windows, the sudden stench of rotting flesh with no identifiable source, and the faint sound of voices murmuring behind closed doors. The Smurls, practical and religious, dismissed these first signs as the quirks of an old home. After all, who would believe that evil had an address? Then the damage started. Walls would bleed with a dark, sticky substance that defied cleaning. The television would flicker even when unplugged. Tools vanished from Jack's workshop, only to reappear days later in impossible places. Once, on the roof. Shadow figures began to dart from corner to corner, always just beyond the periphery of vision. Their daughters began complaining of nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming, convinced that something had been in the room with them. Janet tried to rationalize everything. She blamed stress, the pressure of raising 4 children, and the trauma of losing their previous home. But nothing could explain the bruises that appeared on her arms each morning, or the claw marks gouged into her bedroom door. One evening, while doing laundry in the basement, Janet felt something grab her wrist. She turned, expecting to see one of her daughters playing a prank, but she was alone. The grip was ice cold, and the invisible force yanked her violently across the room. When she told Jack, his expression was a mixture of fear and helplessness. They both knew something was happening. They just didn't know what. Then, it escalated. A heavy fixture fell from the ceiling and nearly struck one of the children. Strange. Puddles of water formed in the middle of dry floors. Electronic devices, including their record player and kitchen appliances, began turning on by themselves. The family's dog refused to enter certain rooms, growling and cowering as if facing an unseen enemy. Neighbors began whispering. One mentioned seeing lights flicker through the windows late at night. Another swore they heard screams, though the house appeared silent from the outside. The Smurls began to isolate themselves. Jack, once cheerful and sociable, grew distant. Janet spent her days in fear, barely sleeping. They brought in electricians, plumbers, and inspectors. No one could explain the disturbances. A priest blessed the home, and for a brief moment, the house was quiet. But peace was short-lived. The blessing seemed to provoke whatever lurked within. That night, the entire house shook violently, as if gripped by an unseen earthquake. The girls cried. Janet clutched a crucifix in the dark. Jack stood in the living room, staring into the empty hallway where a shadow moved against the light. What had they brought into their home? Or worse, what had always been there, waiting for someone to see it? The family was now entangled in something far beyond their comprehension, and the house, once a symbol of healing, had become a trap they couldn't escape. Weeks passed, and the house on Chase Street seemed to grow more aware of the Smurls. What once felt like isolated, confusing events began to take on a pattern, a malicious intelligence, probing their fears and pressing into their weaknesses. The family no longer felt alone, not even in broad daylight. Janet was the first to realize that whatever haunted their home wasn't content with mere tricks. One night, as she folded laundry in the living room, she noticed a shape, darker than the darkness, standing at the top of the stairs. It didn't move. It simply watched. Her breath caught in her throat. By the time she called for Jack and pointed, it was gone. He believed her. He had to, because he'd seen it too. The shadow came back, again and again. Sometimes it appeared in the hallway mirror, its head tilted unnaturally. Other times it stood beside the children's beds while they slept. It was always silent, always motionless, and always left behind the same repulsive scent of sulfur and rot. As the entity's presence intensified, so did its audacity. The Smurls would hear heavy footsteps pacing in the attic, but no one was there. Doors would slam violently, even when locked. Furniture scraped across the floor by unseen hands. Objects would fly across rooms, a ceramic vase shattered inches from one daughter's head. A kitchen chair was hurled at Jack without warning. The nights were the worst. The temperature in the house would drop so drastically that frost formed on the inside of the windows. The bedsheets would be ripped off in the dead of night, and whispers, often in guttural, inhuman tones, echoed through the walls. Jack began to change. He became withdrawn, tormented by a recurring dream in which he was dragged into a pit of fire by laughing voices. Janet's sleep was no better. One morning she awoke to find bruises forming a handprint on her back. Far too large to be Jack's. She hadn't heard anything. She hadn't seen anything. But something had been in their room. One of the daughters began sleepwalking, always to the same spot, the attic. She'd stand at the base of the stairs, eyes open but unseeing, murmuring the same phrase over and over. "They don't want us here." When she was finally shaken awake, she'd cry inconsolably, unable to explain what she'd seen in her dreams. The family reached a breaking point when their youngest daughter claimed she was being pulled from her bed by a woman with no face. Jack, fueled by desperation, tried to stay awake every night, crucifix in hand, rosary clutched tight. But it didn't stop the attacks. They stopped inviting guests. No one believed them. Some even laughed, suggesting stress or hallucination. But when Jack's mother, a woman of unwavering faith, witnessed a cabinet door rip itself open and smash the dishes inside without any physical trigger, her face turned pale. "This house," she whispered, "is not ours anymore." The family began keeping a journal, documenting every event. Janet contacted the diocese again, pleading for help. They were advised to pray, to remain strong in faith, but no priest came, and the entity, emboldened by their isolation, grew more aggressive. It became impossible to deny. The Smurls were not just experiencing a haunting, they were being hunted. What? Do you think of what you've seen so far? Could you imagine living in a house that turns against you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps us uncover the truth behind these chilling cases. What had started as subtle disturbances had now become a campaign of terror. The entity in the Smurl household no longer confined itself to fright. It now intended to dominate, control, and harm. Jack was the first to experience what could only be described as physical assault. Late one night, as he tried to sleep, he felt the bed shift, not from movement but from weight, as if someone had climbed onto it. He opened his eyes to find no one, but he couldn't move. His limbs were paralyzed. Then came the crushing pressure on his chest. He gasped for air, and in that moment he felt it. A presence pressing against him, something unseen, something cold. It whispered into his ear in a language he didn't recognize, guttural and ancient. He woke up screaming. Janet, too, fell victim to more than just fear. She began to experience moments of lost time. She would blink and suddenly be standing in a different room with no memory of how she'd gotten there. One evening while bathing, she felt a hand, large, rough, and wet, grip her shoulder. When she turned, there was nothing. Just a faint laughter echoing in the steam. But it was not just psychological. The entity began violating the sanctity of their bodies. One night, Jack awoke with deep scratches across his chest. He claimed he'd felt something climb on top of him, a grotesque figure with sunken eyes and rotting flesh. It grinned as it forced him down. Jack, a devout Catholic, was shattered. What he experienced wasn't a nightmare. He knew what had happened. He had been assaulted. Janet, too, endured similar horrors. She refused to speak of them at first, ashamed, uncertain, and terrified of not being believed. But the bruises, the bite marks, they were real. And they told a story of a predator that took pleasure in torment. They had nowhere to run. The duplex was their only home. Moving was impossible, emotionally, financially. Worse, every attempt to confront the entity only seemed to excite it. Prayers triggered violent shaking throughout the house. Religious icons were defiled, rosaries snapped by unseen hands, and crucifixes were found upside down. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred when their dog, who had always barked at the shadows, suddenly went silent. The family found him cowering in the corner of the basement, eyes wide, as if he had seen something that didn't belong to this world. From that day forward, he refused to enter the home's upper floor. By now, the family was no longer sleeping. The children were traumatized. Jack had developed severe migraines and erratic mood swings. Janet's hair began falling out in clumps. The stress, the constant fear, was slowly unraveling them. Local clergy remained distant. Some refused to believe the family. Others admitted they were simply not equipped to handle such a case. The Smurls had entered a private war, one they never asked for, and one where the enemy remained unseen. In desperation, Janet began researching the supernatural. She read about hauntings, about spirits, and eventually about demonic entities. That was when she discovered the names Ed and Lorraine Warren. The stories, the books, the testimonials, it was all there. People just like them, torn apart by dark forces, but guided to safety by the Warrens. With trembling hands, Janet picked up the phone. She had nothing left to lose. When Ed and Lorraine Warren first answered Janet Smurl's call, they weren't strangers to terror. They had walked through homes where voices called from walls and objects moved on their own. But as Lorraine pressed the phone to her ear and heard Janet's trembling voice, she felt something different, something colder. A few days later, the Warrens arrived in West Pittston. The moment Lorraine stepped over the threshold, she froze. Her eyes closed as she reached out with her senses. The air was heavy, not with the usual residual energy of haunted homes, but with the thick presence of something malevolent. She whispered to Ed, "It's here, and it's strong." Ed Warren, a demonologist trained by the church, took notes while listening to the family's account. He had heard hundreds of stories over the years, but never one where multiple family members were attacked physically, emotionally, and spiritually by such a coordinated force. He immediately suspected demonic infestation. They began their investigation with interviews and environmental analysis. Lorraine walked through the home, pausing in each room, feeling the residue of past events. She gasped upon entering the master bedroom. "There's something in this house that feeds on fear. It watches, it waits." Ed set up audio equipment to capture electronic voice phenomena. What they recorded sent chills down their spines. Low growls, faint weeping, and, in one chilling instance, a voice clearly stating, "You are mine." The Warrens contacted the local diocese to request an official exorcism, but church protocols required undeniable proof. They would need more than testimonies and recordings. Ed, never one to wait for bureaucracy, began performing minor blessings, prayers of protection, and spiritual warfare rituals. That night, the entity responded. The home erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the room with unseen force. Janet was thrown against a wall. Ed held up a crucifix and shouted a Latin prayer, but the air turned sour, heavy with sulfur, and the temperature plummeted. Lorraine, usually composed, cried out as she was nearly knocked off her feet by an invisible blow. Afterward, Ed told the Smurls what they had dreaded to hear. "This is not a ghost. This is not the spirit of a dead human being. This is demonic, and it has attached itself to you, not just this house." The implications were terrifying. If the entity was indeed demonic and attached to the family, simply moving would not be enough. It would follow them. Wherever they went, it would be there. The Warrens stayed for several days, conducting a series of cleansing rituals and calling upon trusted spiritual allies. But each time they drove it out, it seemed to return, angrier, stronger. Lorraine confided in Janet one night, "This one, it doesn't just want to scare you, It wants to break you. Media attention began to stir. As word spread of the Warrens' involvement, local reporters began showing up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. Some mocked the family, others sympathized. But inside the Smurl home, none of that mattered. The demon was no longer just tormenting. It was declaring war, and the Smurls were on the front lines with Ed and Lorraine as their only hope. The Warrens knew that facing a demonic force meant more than confronting an invisible enemy. It required understanding its origin, its reason for being. Evil does not appear without cause. It roots itself in history, in trauma, in sin. And, in the Smurl house, that history was ready to speak. Ed began researching the land. He dug through property records, newspaper archives, and old death certificates. What he uncovered painted a disturbing portrait. The area had once been home to violent altercations in the 1800s. There were rumors of forbidden rituals performed in nearby woods, unexplained deaths, and whispers of a man who disappeared after claiming to see the devil in his barn. Lorraine, meanwhile, meditated in silence, allowing herself to drift into a light trance state to connect with the energy that pervaded the home. During one session, she gasped and gripped Ed's hand tightly. "There was blood here," she whispered. "A sacrifice, but not an animal." The entity, she explained later, had likely been summoned long ago, perhaps unintentionally, and it had never left. Over the years, it lay dormant, feeding off pain, waiting for a family vulnerable enough to torment. The Smurls were not weak, but they were hurting, losing their home to a flood, starting over, financial stress, spiritual fatigue, the perfect storm for something dark to slip through. Ed began documenting their findings. They photographed burn marks that appeared on walls overnight, collected audio of deep growls and whispered threats, and recorded temperatures in rooms that dropped to sub-zero within seconds. In one video, a shadow figure could be seen passing behind Ed during a prayer session, a blur of darkness with no source of light or reflection. The church was still slow to respond. Bureaucracy, politics, and skepticism delayed their intervention. Ed was frustrated. He believed every day without intervention was another day the Smurls' souls were under siege. "People always wait until someone dies," he muttered. "Then they believe." But they pressed on. Lorraine experienced another vision. In it, she saw a grotesque figure hovering over Jack as he slept, not attacking, but whispering, filling his dreams with dread. She saw the entity caressing the children's beds while they slept, whispering lies to weaken their spirits. One day, while conducting a cleansing in the basement, Ed felt the air grow thick. He turned and saw it, not just a shadow, but a form, tall, impossibly thin, with empty eyes and a smile that screamed malice. It did not move. It did not blink. It simply stared. Ed raised his crucifix and began to chant, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. Lorraine joined in, her voice shaking. The lights flickered, the room trembled, and then it was gone. But they both knew the truth. It wasn't defeated. It had only retreated. They reviewed everything with the Smurls. Lorraine spoke gently. "This is not your fault. You did not invite it. But it is feeding on you, and it will not stop until it is cast out completely." The family was exhausted. Janet's eyes were hollow. Jack had stopped smiling. The children no longer laughed. Even the grandparents seemed defeated. Still, the Warrens promised not to give up. "We've seen worse," Ed lied, trying to offer comfort. But in private, he admitted to Lorraine, This might be the one we can't fix," and that thought haunted them as much as any demon ever had. By the 6th month of torment, the Smurl family was beginning to unravel. What once bound them, faith, love, routine, was now under siege from every angle. Jack and Janet, once united in their struggle, had started arguing, not just about the haunting, but about everything: parenting, money, decisions. The demon, it seemed, had found its way into the cracks of their unity, prying them apart with surgical precision. Ed warned them about this. "It doesn't just attack the body," he said. "It goes after the bond, the soul of the family. Divide and conquer." Their daughters became quieter, withdrawn. The youngest, barely 6, stopped speaking altogether after claiming the lady in the wall told her to keep secrets. The grandparents, too, were showing signs of wear. They no longer dared walk through the home alone, even during the day. The Warrens were unrelenting in their efforts. Ed called in trusted clergy who had worked with him on prior cases. Minor exorcisms were attempted again, using prayers from the Roman ritual, the same texts used by the Vatican. Holy water was splashed across door frames. Incense burned in every corner. Sacred metals were placed above each bed, and yet the attacks continued. Jack claimed he heard voices chanting from the basement. Janet awoke to see the bedsheets forming into the shape of a human body next to her. One of the girls screamed during dinner as the chandelier above them began to spin wildly before detaching and crashing to the floor. The media caught wind of the story. A local tabloid published an article calling it the demonic duplex. Soon the house was surrounded by reporters, thrill seekers, and skeptics with cameras. The Smurl's private torment had become public entertainment. A local talk radio host invited Ed Warren to speak. He accepted, hoping it might pressure the church to act faster. On air, he explained the seriousness of the case. This isn't a ghost story. This is a war for the soul of a family. But not everyone believed him. Critics began to suggest the Smurls were fabricating the haunting for attention. Others accused the Warrens of using the family to gain fame. Janet received anonymous letters calling her a liar. Jack was mocked at work. Their daughters were bullied at school. Inside the home, the mocking continued. Only now it came from the entity itself. During one prayer session, a guttural voice echoed from the walls, imitating Janet's sobs. At night, it began to speak. To Jack using his father's voice, twisting words of comfort into threats. You failed your family, Jack. You let it in. The emotional toll was catastrophic. Jack's health declined. He suffered blackouts, moments of rage he could not remember. Janet's faith faltered. She stopped praying, convinced God had abandoned them. Even Lorraine Warren was shaken. After one cleansing, she sat silently in their car for nearly an hour, staring into space. It doesn't want to be cast out, she told Ed. It enjoys this. The Smurls faced a terrible question. What if help never came? What if no priest was brave enough, no ritual strong enough, no faith deep enough? They were no longer just fighting for their peace. They were fighting for their sanity and their souls. By the 7th month, hope had become a rare and fragile thing in the Yuan Smurl household. Following media pressure and the Warrens' persistent documentation, the diocese finally dispatched an official representative. Father O'Leary, a seasoned priest with a quiet strength, arrived with holy oils, relics, and a solemn warning. If this truly is what you claim, it will fight back. The first formal exorcism took place on a cold Sunday morning. The house, silent for hours before, began to vibrate with a low hum the moment the prayers started. Candles flickered, then exploded. The crucifix above the fireplace turned upside down, as if pulled by invisible hands. Father O'Leary read from the Rite of Exorcism in Latin, his voice steady. But the air turned thick, and the temperature dropped sharply. Lorraine clutched her chest. "It's here," she whispered, watching, mocking. Then the screams began, not from the family but from the walls. Inhuman cries, layered and distorted, echoed through every room. Objects flew, books caught fire. Janet collapsed, convulsing, her eyes rolled back, foam forming at her lips. The children wailed as furniture slammed into walls. The exorcism was halted. Father O'Leary, visibly shaken, requested a retreat. "We need more than prayer," he told Ed privately. "We need fasting, sacred rites. This thing is ancient." Over the following weeks, 2 more exorcisms were attempted. Each one failed. The demon grew bolder. Jack began hearing his name, screamed in the middle of the night, from inside his own head. Lorraine saw visions of an altar drenched in blood, with Jack bound to it, weeping. One daughter spoke in a voice not her own, describing sins no child should know. Even the Warrens began to lose faith. I've never seen something resist this much, Ed admitted. It adapts, it evolves, and it knows us now. It knows what scares us. One night while preparing for a final cleansing, Ed was attacked. As he recited protective prayers, an invisible force struck him in the chest, sending him flying backward. Lorraine ran to his side, only to find deep scratches forming on his arms as if carved by claws. "This is beyond infestation," she said. "It's a full possession, not of a person, but of this entire place." The house itself seemed alive. Walls bled, doors warped. The very air vibrated with hate. The entity, Ed theorized, had embedded itself into the spiritual fabric of the structure. No priest, no rite could reach it unless something changed. But how do you fight an enemy that doesn't fear God, that doesn't sleep, that delights in your suffering? The Smurls were nearing collapse. Jack no longer left the house. He spoke to shadows. Janet began journaling not to remember, but to keep herself from forgetting who she was. The children cried at the sound of footsteps. And yet, amidst all this, the demon laughed. In their darkest hour, Ed looked at Lorraine with eyes heavy from sleepless nights. "What if we can't save them?" he asked. Lorraine didn't answer. The silence said enough. The media storm that had once buzzed at the edges of the Smurls' lives now crashed through the front door. As word of the failed exorcisms spread, local and national news outlets descended upon the quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood. Television trucks lined the street. Journalists knocked endlessly. Cameras flashed from sidewalks. The Smurl family's hell was no longer confined to their walls. It had become a national spectacle. The press dubbed the house the Devil's Duplex. Reporters speculated wildly, tossing out theories ranging from environmental toxicity to mass hysteria. Some claimed it was a psychological crisis born of financial strain. Others accused the Warrens of staging the haunting to sell books and films. What had begun as a cry for help now looked to the outside world like theater. Janet, in particular, became the focus of cruel commentary. Tabloids painted her as unstable. Talk show hosts made jokes at her expense. Another housewife driven mad by ghosts, one newspaper scoffed. She cried silently at the kitchen table as headlines twisted her suffering into punchlines. Jack didn't fare any better. Once proud and composed, he now looked haggard and hollow during interviews. During one televised appearance, he broke down and shouted at the host, "This isn't a joke. My family is being tortured." The clip went viral, and not with sympathy. The Warrens attempted damage control. Ed gave public statements defending the family. Lorraine sat for interviews, recounting her visions and experiences. But for every believer they reached, 10 more skeptics emerged. Meanwhile, the haunting persisted. The entity now seemed to feed on the attention. It responded to news reports with bursts of rage, slamming doors, growling in front of the children, setting off fire alarms without cause. It appeared in mirrors during interviews, visible just long enough to send chills down spines. The Smurls were prisoners in their own home, but now they were prisoners in the court of public opinion too. Teachers treated the children differently. Neighbors stopped visiting. Even extended family distanced themselves. Still, the suffering continued. Janet began to hear mocking voices coming from the static of the television. Jack claimed to see reporters' faces twist into demonic forms during broadcasts. One daughter, caught on video, began to laugh hysterically during a prayer, a laugh that was not hers. The church grew silent. The diocese refused further comment. And while the Warrens continued to defend the family, they were met with resistance at every level. "It's become politicized," Ed said. "They're more afraid of scandal than the devil." The most devastating moment came when a skeptical psychologist labeled the entire case a shared delusion. He argued the family had created the demon as a way to cope with grief and pressure. "There is no evidence," he said, "just fear." Janet listened to the broadcast in silence. Then she stood and walked to the bedroom where the words, "Get out," had appeared overnight in scratches across the wall. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "I wish we could." But the house, and whatever lived in it, wasn't done with them yet. By the 9th month, there was little left of the Smurl family as the world had once known them. Jack had become a ghost of himself. The strong, quiet provider was now paranoid, withdrawn, and barely coherent. He spoke in fragments, often to people who weren't there. During one particularly disturbing episode, he was found standing in the hallway at 3 a.m., holding a kitchen knife, muttering, "I have to protect them. It's coming for them." Janet was no longer the vibrant, determined mother she had once been. Her face was pale, her eyes dark from lack of sleep. She wore the same clothes for days, barely ate, and had taken to sitting in the girls' room at night, cross-legged on the floor, reading scripture aloud until sunrise. The children were the most silent victims. Their laughter had vanished. They avoided mirrors. They cried without cause. The oldest daughter began to scratch at her own arms until they bled, saying it was the only way to stop the whispers. One day, the youngest asked Janet, "If we die, will it stop hurting?" The entity had broken through every line of defense. Religious icons were no longer feared. They were desecrated in new and vile ways. The house groaned at all hours, as if alive and suffering with them. Lights would explode. Pipes burst. The smell of decay lingered in every corner. The Smurls began to turn on one another. Jack accused Janet of bringing the demon in. Janet accused Jack of not doing enough to stop it. The grandparents tried to mediate but were overwhelmed. Their faith, once a shield, now felt useless. They began to whisper about leaving, about abandoning the home, and maybe even the family. Jack took it the hardest. Already emotionally fractured, he fell into a deep and dangerous despair. He stopped speaking to the Warrens. He stopped praying. And then, one night, he disappeared. Janet found him the next morning in the church, asleep in a pew, holding a Bible to his chest like a lifeline. The priest, unaware of the full extent of the situation, had found him sobbing near the altar, pleading with God not to let his children be taken. It was that moment, that fragile, broken plea, that finally shook the church into action. Formal letter arrived days later. A high-level exorcist would be sent. One final attempt. One final war for the soul of the family and the house that had nearly destroyed them. But the Smurls were already considering something unthinkable. Separation. Not from the entity, from each other. They spoke in whispers about sending the children away. About Janet going to live with her sister. About Jack checking into a psychiatric clinic. "It's the only way to survive," Janet whispered one night to Lorraine. "We're going to lose each other before we lose to the demon." Lorraine took her hand. "Not if we stand together. That's what it fears most. Unity." But unity was hard to find in a house that fed on fear, sowed mistrust, and thrived on despair. And still, the darkest chapter had yet to unfold. The EY final exorcism took place in the heart of summer, yet the air inside the Smurl home was colder than ever. A senior exorcist from the church arrived, cloaked in silence and formality. His presence was like steel, calm, unshakable, yet weighted with purpose. Ed and Lorraine Warren were by his side, more determined than ever, but with the weary eyes of soldiers who had been fighting a war for too long. The ritual began at dawn. Latin chants echoed through the house as incense filled the air. Holy water was sprinkled across every threshold. The priest moved room by room, invoking saints and angels, calling upon divine wrath to cast out whatever had made this place its domain. The house screamed. Glass shattered. Furniture levitated. A mirror exploded. Cutting Ed's hand, the priest continued, unwavering. Lorraine fell to her knees, clutching her rosary, her voice trembling as she repeated the Hail Mary. Jack stood behind them, pale and trembling, holding his daughter in his arms. Janet sobbed silently beside the crucifix, her strength nearly gone. Then, silence. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, too unnatural. And for the first time in almost a year, nothing moved. No whispers, no growls, no shadows. Had it worked? The priest closed his book and looked to Ed. "It is done," he said. "But the scars may never fade." For several days, the Smurls experienced calm, The house seemed still. The children slept through the night. Janet smiled again, faintly. Jack returned to work, but peace was fragile. 3 weeks later, the scratching returned. Faint, sporadic, but real. Jack found the words, "Still here," scrawled in the condensation on the bathroom mirror one morning. One of the daughters saw a shadow in the hallway again. Janet heard the growl behind her as she prayed. The truth settled in like a final cruel whisper. The entity had never fully left. And for the first time in their careers, Ed and Lorraine, Warren admitted it. "We've done all we can," Ed told Janet. "This one, it may not be something we can defeat, only endure." The Smurls eventually moved. Far away. The house was sold, the history buried, but the trauma, the wounds, remained. They never spoke publicly about the haunting again. The story faded, eclipsed by newer horrors, newer investigations. But those who knew, truly knew, never forgot. The Smurl case stood as one of the rare moments when evil, raw and unrelenting, refused to yield to prayer, faith, or persistence. A haunting not solved, not banished, but survived, and survival, in the end, was the only victory left.